Hey, good morning. My name is Mike Takkinen. I'm a senior technical something or other for Moose Mountain Technical Services, and we're going to talk about something that what we want to present today is kind of a white paper. Hopefully, one of our objectives is to generate some dialogue, and so we welcome your comments. We're not presenting something as a final solution, but instead some issues that we've learned about over the last while on a few projects that we'd like to engage you guys in. So here we go. Yesterday, Mike Lechner talked about internal dilution, and we're going to pick up the ball where he left it there and focus more on external dilution. And as we do that, we'll showcase some of the MineSight tools we've used to understand that. A couple of brief definitions. I'm sure you all got a definition for dilution, but just so you know what we're talking about, deleterious material included in or influencing the mill feed category, but whose grade characteristics don't inherently pass the ore standard. And we're going to be focusing particularly on external dilution. Mike did a good job covering internal dilution yesterday. It is something that all of us who are dealing with dilution or reserve or mill feed estimates need to be taking into consideration, but our emphasis is going to be on the external dilution side. Okay, so just some examples of, just so we know what we're talking about, some examples of dilution. Low-grade acids that influence composites, that's one form of dilution. Low-grade composites that influence block interpolation, another type of internal dilution. Low-grade model blocks that influence mill feed estimates, another type of dilution. So just, and if you'll notice at each of those places, you're likely going to have a different MineSight practitioner. So this is what we're talking about, interdisciplinary dialogue. When one is dealing with dilution, who's talking or who's handling dilution anyway? Everybody needs to be talking to one another so there isn't double dipping happening in the process. Some costs of dilution. Conquering dilution is about divide and conquer, but there are practical limits. Yesterday, Mike talked about reducing composite length and how that significantly reduced the internal dilution. Jim showed yesterday how practical stope sizes, when you impose a practical limitation on your estimate, it can shrink or change the amount of recoverable ore blocks. You know, if you do go down to a 1 meter or a half meter by half meter block size and spoon it all out, you can recover all the ore, right? And eliminate all the dilution. But that's not practical. So there are costs to reducing dilution. Reducing dilution, like you can build dilution right into your estimate right from the get-go if your sampling intervals aren't short enough. But that costs more to increase sampling and lab costs. It increased processing time, a lot more data to handle if you've got high-frequency sampling, and much more complicated geology and geological interpretation to account for grade variability. When you get to the mining side, managing dilution is all about selective mining, smaller equipment, and more complex mining methods required to segregate the dilution from the ore material. We'll talk more about that later. So where does all this balance out? Like, why would you pursue it if it costs so much to deal with dilution? Really, there are benefits to dilution, and the benefits of dilution are improved confidence or improved resource recovery. And so kind of a starting point for us in this conversation is in the studies that we've done in the past, it's always been shown that resource recovery or metal recovery is a much bigger player than is the dilution factor. So although dilution costs, it's far better for a project economics to include dilution, minimize it, than it is to accept mining losses or metal losses. That's just a general rule of thumb. It's not going to apply at every operation. Okay, one of the costs or some of the costs of dilution that we're trying to offset through improved resource recovery is delayed cash flow. That's a present cost. When you're sending dilution material or deleterious material to the mill, you're taking up mill capacity and you're reducing cash flow, annual cash flow. Reduced grade, of course, that's tied directly in. And you're spending money that you wouldn't have to spend. Milling costs going against milling waste, crushing and milling waste to produce nothing, essentially. But the benefit, again, is that increased confidence that all the metal that's in your model will end up in the mill and then on the market. So I just want to introduce our conversation. We're going to look at a couple of case studies. And just to get the context, I'm going to burn through some slides here, talk about this interdisciplinary. So here's just a bogus data set. We'll call it Mintium. You won't find that on the periodic chart. Okay, cutoff grade of 9.5 grams a ton. Okay, so here's a data set, one big block. If we handed that off just to the metallurgist and he did his assays and averaged it out, the grade average is 5.5. It's not going to make it. We don't have a mine. But what if we include the geostatistician? He comes in and says, wait a minute, if I break that out into smaller regions, I think we can correlate some of the samples and we can produce some economic blocks. So in this case, we got 4 out of the 9 blocks beat our 9.5 cutoff. And then enters the engineer who says, can we actually mine blocks that are 90 degrees to one another? And so says the miner, and the miner says, of course not. We'll just round off the corners. We'll leave a little bit of ore behind. We'll pick up a little bit of dilution. It'll all be good. And the accountant says, well, what are you talking about? We are going to trade off profitable material for unprofitable material. You're going to send waste to the mill? We shouldn't be mining, or we shouldn't be milling blocks that are uneconomic. So the team has to come to a conclusion, and hopefully we'll assume that we'll mine only enough of the unprofitable material to assure recovery of the profitable. So how are we going to do that? Well, at an operating mine, you're going to have dig limits of some sort. Dig lines will be established by the short-range planning group, and they'll be drawn for every shovel. But for a long-range planning operation, that's too big a job, too labor-intensive to do it for every plan in every area, for every bench. So we need to come up with another method of accounting for external dilution and minimizing external dilution in the long-range planning process. That's what we're going to talk about today. So if you use a dilution assumption, you can apply it a couple of different ways. Many of you are familiar with PIT-RES, and PIT-RES has got some dilution assumptions. You can apply the cutoff, when you're using cutoffs in the PIT-RES options, before or after the material's been diluted. So your zone file will have an assumption for percentage of dilution and grade of dilution, and you'll have a cutoff in the panel that indicates what's your minimum grade cutoff, and you can apply the cutoff rule before or after dilution. In this case, if we apply the cutoff rule after dilution, we lose a block of ore, and so it's really a critical decision for the team as to whether or not they're going to apply before or after. And then if we bring the geologist into the team, he says, if you give me just a few more holes, then I can tell you exactly where that contact is. And then we can just build a skin around it, a bit of a buffer, so we know exactly, we can pick up all the mineralization. Well, I'm not going to go through all the numbers on the chart there. All I'm trying to point out here is the more you try to manage dilution from a mine planning point of view, the more complicated things get. And there's a lot of balancing to be done, a lot of mass balancing to be done to make sure that you're honoring the metallurgy, the geologist, all the zones that are incorporated, and so on. But in the end, this is the kind of variability you can see with the different options that you might take. So we've got one set of data, 9 blocks. Depending on what solution we shoot at, we can get anywhere from 30 to 45% range in feed tons, as measured by a number of blocks to the mill, 15 to 20% range in grade, in diluted grade, and therefore cash flow, annual cash flow, 30 to 45% range in total mintium recovered and metal treated and processed. So these are very, very basic and very, very important assumptions to consider from a mine planning point of view. So now we just want to look at a couple of case studies to focus on the external dilution estimate side, and Jesse's going to take it from here for a bit.
Okay. Well, what had happened was, just to introduce kind of the case study a little bit, is we had received a project that the geology was a little bit more complicated. It was basically a thin vein, steeply dipping deposit where it was vein-like, where it wasn't really separable by visual. So we had there was a dilution estimate that was built in, and we just wanted to make sure that we were comfortable with that dilution, so we wanted to get into and study dilution a little bit more. So we went through a process to try and model the dilution rather than just using a global assumption. So basically what happened was we found, and we're going to kind of skip over, like as Mike said, the internal dilution discussion, but we found that was, as we started digging into it, that was definitely a part of the model that we had received. There was internal dilution built in, and we needed to get a better understanding of what was going on with that so that we could have an accurate dilution estimation and of what was going on externally. So we need to understand the internal dilution, and we did that by using, or actually Mike Lechner went through an exercise, and one of the things that you can use to try and understand internal dilution, or what's happening is with respect to your block model sizes, is using this reblocking tool in MS-DART. And that will give you just an idea of how many blocks are above grade, and when you reblock and kind of build them into bigger blocks, where that inflection point is happening with the grade as you go to bigger block sizes. What are you losing or gaining as you go up and down in block size? But the tool that we're using to analyze that is this reblocking tool, which is a pretty handy tool. And this is kind of sort of what you start to see. So basically, as you go from like a very small block size, 2.5 meter cubed, all the way up to, where do we go? 5 by 5 by 15, 15 vertical, you can see that your tons above cutoff and your grade are obviously inversely related. But as you go to a smaller block size, you can get more tons at a higher grade, or the other way around. But basically, they're related to each other, and there is an inflection point. And there's a lower limit on your practicality for block size. I mean, you could keep getting smaller and smaller blocks, but are you actually going to be able to recover those blocks or mine those blocks? You want to make sure that you're thinking about that as you're looking ahead. It's not just a statistical analysis. And just to kind of give you some of the numbers on dilution, we're looking at a project, I forget what the numbers were. It was this project that we were looking at, the average revenue or the average NSR for the block was about $50 a ton, and we're looking at 6.5 million tons a year of plant feed. So when you look at just the dilution and what happens with your dilution as you send more dilution to the plant, you're stretching out your mine life, but you're recovering less metal up front because you're processing more waste. And what happens just from an NPV kind of point of view is that as your dilution increases, your NPV just on delayed revenue, because you're pushing your metal farther out, it can be quite significant in the impact of about $300 million over the life of this project, which is just a 17-year life. So it's fairly significant. It's not a small thing. So you really want to make sure you're modeling your dilution right, so that you can get an accurate idea of what the project is like. So, I mean, you can have a large impact on your total project economics, about 10%, which fits with, kind of some of the dilution numbers that you see. It makes sense. So how do we accurately predict and model dilution, and how do we make sure that we're not, like Mike said, double dipping with the geology model that we get when we're starting to do the mine planning side of things, or that we are accounting for something? Because it could also be the other side is you totally miss dilution, where you have a block model that doesn't have any internal dilution and you don't add any external dilution, and you haven't accounted for dilution at all. So both ways are not good. So just what are some of I'm just going to kind of focus on this case study. What are some of the tools that we used? Just even some of the basics. I'm kind of a visual person, so I just want to see, assuming that you're going to dig up to an ore block with a large shovel on a 15-meter bench and stop at the ore contact. So you have a little 5 by 5 meter block, which is our block size in the model, and it's 15 meters high. That was the first pass that we got. So we said, okay, we'll just extrude that shape down. And this shape represents the ore model block surrounded by waste that's just been left around the edge of the block. So you've dug up to the block and stopped, and then you're going to take all of that and send it to the mill. So that's your dilution. So the total volume minus the ore block is your dilution shape. And based on the number of contact edges, we just built a bunch of geometry shapes. You can see that if with one contact edge, it's a lot smaller. And as the waste contact edges on the ore block go up, the dilution for the block volume rises quite substantially. And then we use this great little tool called GNDILN.dat, which basically goes through based on a specified cutoff grade and will tell you how many waste blocks are surrounding an ore block. So this picture here these are all the ore blocks, in situ blocks that beat our cutoff grade. So they're greater than our NSR cutoff, which is about 8.5, I think. And then after you run GNDILN, you can see that it's went and coded each of those ore blocks has now been coded with the number of waste contact edges. So just kind of showing you this project. You can see some of the blocks are quite scattered from each other, so you're going to have high dilution on those, and we just want to make sure that we're accurately reflecting what that dilution is. And then we go and use the zone input file so we can specify and split out if a block has one waste edge, it's going to have X amount of dilution, and we can say based on how many edges it has, it's going to have this percentage of dilution. So you can get a handle of if the model is kind of scattered and variable in terms of waste edges, you can accurately reflect that number and get a true idea of what the total dilution is for the whole project. Then we end up, when we kind of crunch all the numbers, the calculated dilution using just some of our, was quite high, so 38% is a fairly large dilution, and we just know that that is not, we're not really going to see that. There's got to be a better way to do it. And of course, what you see in operating mines is more selective approach, so let's go to that method. So we just used some kind of nifty little features, took those previous shapes we had built and did copy and scale and kind of broke them up into little 5-meter triple bench scenarios. So you're mining the ore in a triple bench scenario, 5-meter high blocks, and you can see just based on this graph, this was the dilution per waste contact edges, and it drops down to that lower one. So it becomes, your selective mining really reduces your dilution on a per block kind of basis. So it gets you, and then after you do that, we're looking at a loss of around 17% and a dilution around 19%. And the loss is a cutoff grade loss. When you take a block and give it a bunch of dilution, all of a sudden it fails to meet your cutoff grade. So where it was ore, you add dilution, now it's no longer ore. That's what kind of loss we're talking about in this case study. And then also, if you are going to be doing triple bench mining, we want to make sure that we're accurately reflecting those costs. So selective mining comes at a higher cost. So your ore areas where you're going to be mining in a triple bench scenario are going to be higher mining costs. So we want to reflect that in our MSEP, and there's a great way to do that. We can code the model with our selective mining areas, and then we can go and input that into MSEP so that we can accurately reflect those areas where we're going to be mining with a higher cost. So just classify an item in the model that's bulk waste or selectively mined ore or selectively mined waste, which will happen around that ore skin, so that you can make sure that you can separate and separate bulk waste and selective ore and apply different mining costs to those areas so that your MSEP will accurately reflect the amount of money you're going to have to spend to try and get that ore. And then we went through and did one more refinement where we said if we're going to be selective mining, we're going to take the ore first. So we're not going to come and dig the waste up to an ore contact block. We're going to go in and mine the ore first to make sure we get all of that, and then we're going to mine the waste, whatever's left behind it. So we took the GNDILN and flipped it backwards and said, okay, how many ore contact edges does a waste block have? So when I mine the ore block, how much waste is going to come from this block with that? And we use those geometry shapes and just kind of work backwards to calculate a hybrid of a kind of an ore percent. So this block is ore, it's going to be 100% mined. This block has one ore boundary, so part of it's going to be mined with that ore block. So then we can use an ore percent and run, that's one thing I forgot to mention in the zone input file, is you run into a mass balance. You have to make sure you subtract your dilution waste from your total waste. It won't get reported like that when you run your report. The zone input will give you your dilution, but you have to go backwards afterwards and subtract the dilution. So this will stay away from that, where we're just saying, okay, what's the ore percent of the block that's going to be mined? So now we can use PitRes and use the ore percent feature to say, okay, how much is going to be mined of each block, and it gives us a bit of a better idea. And this way, dilution grades are dynamically calculated, so if this waste block, if 25% of it's being mined, you know what the grade is in that block. So you don't have a global dilution grade, you have an actual dilution grade of where it's happening from the block model information. And this is just some of the shapes. Again, we just have an ore block, it's surrounded by kind of waste, or a waste block actually that's surrounded on two sides by ore. So the ore gets mined first, and we use the extrude tool again to kind of build our shapes and get our volumes. And now we can query that element and see how much of that waste block is going to be left behind after the ore blocks are being mined. And we can build a little table that shows a percentage of the block that's being mined, and then use that percentage item as an ore percent in our pit res. And then we go away from the zone input file and we use this feature. The one thing in reality is, and this is the cross-disciplinary or multidisciplinary approach, what you do have to realize is that if you have an ore block and an ore block, your assay interval will have ore outside of there. And as you go through and drill it off and do your sampling, you're going to have ore, so to speak, outside of your ore blocks in your block model. So this is basically economic material that's lost when we do our dilution model based on block models. Here we have an actual ore waste boundary that goes inside the blocks and kind of outside the blocks. This block is an ore block, so to speak, but you have low-grade waste that you're including, and that's kind of an example of your internal dilution. So you want to have an idea of what's going on with internal dilution so that your dilution model can be correct, and that's kind of like the main thing that we were trying to focus on.
So where Jesse was, on his project, was working on I'm the wrong way here. A whole block, starting with a whole block model and then creating a hybrid partial block model. The one I'm going to talk about is a full-blown multiple ore percent partial block model. This is a typical section showing, this is a steeply dipping vein deposit also, but there's, beyond the vein, there's also a disseminated mineralization region. The geometry has been drawn for the kind of the high-grade vein structure internally, but then there's an envelope externally that contains mineralized material that may or may not make economic grade. I don't know if you can see there, but the hatching represents the disseminated zone. There's some of the zone inside that polygon that shows no hatching. That's where the ore goes uneconomic. So this is the deposit we were working with on this particular project. Okay, so we got in the model we had 2 zones per block, the core vein and the disseminated region. The model block configuration was 10 by 10 by 5. And for the purposes of dilution, we had converted the multiple metals that were in the geological model to an equivalent primary metal, and then diluted on the basis of equivalent primary metals. Okay, we had a couple of options to address the external dilution on this project. One would be to create dilution skins by expanding existing mineralized shapes with the surfaced expand tool. And I tried that on a couple of the simpler shapes, and it worked well. But we also realized that in the disseminated region, we were going to be dealing with a lot of holes in that structure. So the solids we would have had to create by saving grade shells and then expanding those. And then every time we wanted to do an iteration, we would have had to go all the way back to the solids, re-expand the solids, retreat the solids to make sure their integrity was good, and then recode the model. So we thought that at this stage would be, although it would be more accurate, it would be too labor intensive. So we chose instead to simulate a dilution skin mathematically using procedures. Okay, so a couple more definitions to talk about. This is just talking about the relationship between what might be a 100% topo block. The topo block, if it's a partial ore block, is going to have a portion of it mill feed and a portion of it waste. The mill feed is going to be made up of vein material and dilution. The dilution might be internal or external dilution if it's skin dilution, which is brought in by the mining process or the mine planning process, or internal dilution if it's part of the estimate. Within the vein, I mentioned the disseminated zone didn't always have economic ore in it. Some of the blocks were interpolated to be subgrade. So the vein percent that normally would be used in pit res to determine your contact blocks didn't always apply. Sometimes you'd have 100% vein percent in the model, but the block would be sub-economic, so the vein percent wouldn't translate to ore. So there's vein percent, just the balance is ore plus subgrade is going to be equal to the vein percent that comes from your geometry partials, and dilution is internal dilution plus external dilution. So this is an overview of the multi-run. The multi-run, I didn't count how many procedures. It probably makes a few dozen passes through the model to do what we wanted to do. But basically, these are the steps that we're following through on. The first step is to tag the model. We use mod class, And P61201, the update to that is the CP Model Calc tool. I'm still using the user calc just because it's been around for a long time and I got lots of gray hair. Okay. Then we take the tagged ore and waste blocks and we do configuration tagging as well using the GNDILN procedure that Jesse showed last time. We used it in both directions, both from an ore complexity and from a waste complexity perspective. Then we determine the external dilution partials. This is where we're estimating or mathematically estimating what the dilution skin volumes would be, and we're using modclass.dat and 61201 to do that. And then we go through with the classifications made, we go through and we assign the external dilution grades by transferring grades, block estimates from one category to another. So the high grade core is going to have the highest grade. If there's a disseminated grade available, that becomes the dilution grade for the high grade partials. If there's a subgrade available, that becomes the dilution grade for the disseminated grade external dilution. And then finally, we after assigning the dilution grades, the skin grades, we have to re-rationalize the model because we're adding partials to a model that was already at 100% containment. So we rationalize the blocks, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but we rationalize the blocks so that if you had a block that only had 80% of a vein partial in it, but you were adding 40% external dilution to it because of its complexity, rationalizing using PCT-RAT brings the total block partials back to 100, so you're not overestimating your material. And then reporting results. So ModClass has been presented here earlier. This is a great tool. If you're not familiar with it, you should get familiar with it if you have anything to do with coding models. You can code on multiple conditions. So basically what you're doing is on a range, on a zone or a zone range, what model item conditions need to exist in order to determine a particular coding type. And so I think on the panel you're allowed up to 4 or 5 different model items that you can classify on. If you want to go beyond that, it's not a procedure limitation, but it's a panel limitation. You can create a zone input file to go for 6, 7, 8 model items if you wish to. Okay, so this is just a screenshot of a plan and a sectional model view. I know it's pretty colorful. If that's good for you, that's good. But what we're showing here in the background, the big slabs are block tagging of the dilution type. So the purple is the border blocks. That's showing the backwards, like the waste, how many ore contact blocks does a waste block have. So the purple shows those blocks. The light blue is subgrade blocks. The green are blocks that are partially ore and partially waste, so those will be subject to adding external dilution in. And then the red blocks in the background are the blocks that are 100% ore, so there won't be any dilution added to those blocks. Shown as 3D blocks, I don't know if the resolution's there, but the 3D blocks, the smaller inside the big slabs are yellow and orange. The yellow and orange just indicates the ore tagging for disseminated and high grade. Okay, so it's just a close-up on the block configuration for using a number of waste edges against the ore. And this is classified for each of the ore types, so the disseminated and the high grade. Red blocks are ore completely surrounded by waste. Blue blocks are ore completely surrounded by other ore blocks. Okay, as Jesse showed earlier, one option is to assign dilution based on the number of edges on here, but that creates a mass balance problem. So you've got 100% blocks that are attracting dilution, and that's no good. We don't create volume in our group. Okay, so we use the GNDILN.dat procedure instead in the other direction to show how many ore contacts does a waste contact have, on the assumption that blocks with 3 or 4 ore edges should contribute a different amount of dilution, external dilution, because it's more complicated to separate than would a block that's just a single edge block. Okay, then we use ModClass again to determine the final external dilution volume. So this just shows the external dilution that's being assigned to the blocks in the 2 different zones. So there's two components to the external dilution estimate. One is the skin partial, and that's as I mentioned earlier, based on the complexity of the block. And then the second part is on subgrade, where blocks are 100% inside the mineralized zone, but they're not economic ore. So in those cases, we go in and ore first mine, so we're going to be recovering subgrade and recovering as much as we can to reduce and minimize external dilution. So final dilution is equal to the skin dilution plus or less the amount of subgrade that we can recover, and then added any transfer volume. Final external dilution grade. What are we talking about here? Oh, okay. I was just talking about assigning external dilution grade. This is just talking about the movement of grade estimates. We've got estimates for each of the zones, and what we do is just move from one priority to, or from one level to the other. Disseminated becomes the dilution grade for high grade. Waste becomes the dilution grade for disseminated. PCT RAT, I mentioned that for rationalizing back so that we never have more than 100% material in the block. And what was the outcome? Well, our goal was to create an explicit or a visualized external dilution assumption so we could show that to our client. We could visually check it, see it ourselves. Jesse mentioned he's a visual guy, so am I. I like to see my results on screen, so MindSight is a great tool for that. We wanted to develop a system that accounted for contacts and complexity, not just contacts. So the number of ore edges became a part of that. And we wanted to identify the two different types of feed that we're bringing to the mill feed. It's not just a pure ore grade estimate, it's ore plus dilution, and we wanted to show that on both zones. So what we showed, or what we found in the final analysis was external dilution varied with model conditions, of course, because that's what we're basing our algorithms on. And the ranges from a bench-to-bench basis went from 10 to 40%, depending on the grade variability in the block model. So when I compared this routine with using the pit-res assumption for contact assumption, in this case, it was almost triple the dilution, external dilution that pit-res was estimating for the same bench. And the reason for that is the complexity assumption that I'm making on the basis of ore edges. And also, I believe that the treatment of subgrade blocks is a little different in pit-res than on this one. But what we end up with is a model dilution partial inside the model instead of a global assumption that's used outside the model. Okay, just a few things for consideration, and these are questions for the crowd. If you want to talk to us later on, we'd love to hear your comments. Some things that we will be considering in future dilution modeling will be the use of geostats, variography to define dilution skin thickness. If your goal is really to assure 100% inclusion of ore, then how big does the skin have to be in order to assure that? Some of the tools in MSDA, contact analysis and so on, will help us with that. The possibility of interpolating 2 grades per block. I'd like to hear from modelers on that. A grade that'll be what would be an internal dilution grade and an ore grade estimate on a per block basis. I can't see using only the ore block all the time, but in blocks where there's a horizon condition, where there's a contact block, it may be useful to use the subgrade estimate to account for low grade or for your dilution grade, and the ore grade only for the second mark. So that's one thing I want to consider. In MSEP, we want to look at how dilution tons are treated on the economic side. At this point, you'd have to fatten up your mill costs by a percentage that reflects your dilution in order to properly account for the cost of milling that extra material. We want to look at alternatives for that. I'm not sure how the sub-blocking system that Mintech's proposing is going to affect this, but I'll be sitting in on one of those sessions there. I'd like to hear how that might fit in. And then I used for the reporting on the reporting side, I used CompRes, CMP-Res, which was intended for coal, but fit really nicely with the ore plus dilution ore types, and pit-Res. But neither one did it quite what I wanted to. Tech support said I should have been using MSIP. I guess another indication of my age. Just haven't made the move. Okay, so that's our presentation.